Do you really think Rome built its vast empire on courage alone? In truth, there was much more to it. Debt. We all know those unstoppable Roman soldiers from the movies, full of honor and discipline. But behind those shining helmets and sharp swords was a supply chain so complex and costly, it's hard to imagine. Thousands of soldiers needed food, weapons, roads, and pay. Horses needed feed. Siege engines had to be built. And all of this required one thing: money. More money than anyone could dream of. So where did Rome find the cash for all those conquests? And why does that still matter today? Because when we take a closer look at Rome's war machine, we see something fascinating. War wasn't won just with swords. It was won through the financial system itself. And once that system began to run, stopping it became impossible. Expansion wasn't a choice anymore. It became an economic necessity. Don't we see similar patterns today? Let's rewind a bit. In the early Republic, Rome's army was made up of landowning citizens. If you were drafted, you grabbed your own weapons and went to war, then returned to your farm afterward. But as the empire expanded, wars grew longer and farther from home. The old system stopped working. The days of "I'll grab a spear and fight for a year" were over. Rome needed professional soldiers. That's when Rome began to centralize its finances. The state started paying its soldiers. Not much, just enough to keep their loyalty. But the real turning point was this: conquest itself became a business model. Every new city meant new taxes, new slaves, new gold mines. War was funding more war, a perfect vicious cycle. And here's where things get interesting and dangerous. Rome didn't run on taxes alone. It was drowning in debt. During massive wars like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the state took huge loans from the wealthy elite, the so-called equites, Rome's financial class. These weren't patriotic donations. They were clear investments. And the investors wanted their returns, interest payments, tax collection rights, and commercial privileges in newly conquered lands. In short, war became a profitable business. And the more profitable it was, the more wars Rome fought. Sound familiar? Over time, this war economy changed everything. Power shifted to generals who could promise spoils. Senators became shareholders in violence. Private contractors, the publicani, took over everything from logistics to tax collection, taking massive cuts along the way. It was like a global logistics network, with horse-drawn carts. And the costs? They piled up like mountains. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state constantly needed new revenue. When conquests slowed or rebellions broke out, the treasury ran dry. So what did Rome do? It turned to the oldest trick in the book: debase the currency. Starting with Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. For centuries, this continued. What was once a solid silver coin became a hollow tin piece. Inflation exploded. Trust collapsed. By the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. Meanwhile, the rich got richer. They hid their wealth in land, slaves, and overseas accounts. The common people paid taxes in devalued money, while the elite chased tax exemptions and sweetheart contracts. Public service almost vanished. Corruption soared. And the endless wars, their cost, through inflation and forced labor, fell squarely on the backs of peasants and farmers. This wasn't just the collapse of an empire, it was the collapse of money itself. Now pause for a second and look at today. Governments running massive budget deficits. Wars financed by debt. Central banks quietly reducing the value of money to close the gap, what they now call quantitative easing. A financial class growing richer from defense contracts and crisis profiteering. You'll notice something. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the structure, the DNA, looks disturbingly familiar. The lesson Rome gives us is simple. An economy based on constant expansion, military or economic, will eventually hit a wall. There comes a point when there's nothing left to conquer, no more resources to exploit. And that's when the system begins to turn inward, against its own people. So what did Rome do? More taxes, more debasement, more control. Bread and circuses to silence the masses, while the elites fortified their villas. Just like today, right? We don't call it tribute anymore. We call it taxation, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But it's still the same game. Central banks print money. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich buy assets. The poor buy groceries with shrinking paychecks. Wars are still financed through debt. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, most of it borrowed. So who got the contracts? Who earned the interest? And who's paying the bill through inflation and weaker public services? You already know. And just like in Rome, the cycle feeds itself. Once borrowing becomes normal, you don't need a crisis to print money, just the fear of collapse. What was once exceptional becomes ordinary. And the longer it goes on, the more we pretend everything's fine, until it isn't. That's why economic history matters. These aren't dusty old tales. They're warning signs. When we look at Rome, we see a system that handed its power to private finance, became addicted to expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its own citizens under unsustainable weight. Not because they were evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today we live in a different kind of empire, digital, global, and powered by capital flows instead of legions. But the game is almost the same. Money and power still move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the weak. And financial illusions still work, until they don't. So what can we do? The first step is to see the pattern, because most people don't. Most people think inflation is fate, taxes are just necessary, debt is freedom, and growth can go on forever. But do you know what the Stoics called that? Delusion. We can't completely escape the system, that's true, but we can understand it. We can stop playing the game blindly. We can build our own resilience. Not just with money, but with mindset. That's why we should study financial history, not just personal finance. We should pay attention not to market hype, but to cracks of systemic stress. And we should ask, who profits when I stay confused? Because what's usually expected of us? To focus on the theater, the headlines, the numbers, the distractions, not on the mechanisms, not on who's really winning. But that's exactly what we're doing here. Understanding the mechanism. And once you see the pattern, it's really hard to unsee it. Financial education isn't just about budgeting. It's about understanding power, understanding systems, and seeing through the illusion of stability. So next time you hear about a new conflict, a new stimulus package, or a new crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask, who's lending, who's earning, and who's paying the bill in the end? Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Empires rarely fall because an enemy breaks the gates. They fall because the math stops working, and no one dares to fix it. If you enjoyed this perspective and want to explore more stories like this together, don't forget to subscribe. The answers are hidden in the dusty pages of history, and together we're going to find them.